Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced at North Idaho College on the shores of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guest.
I am most pleased to welcome you to our program today, and I'm also happy to report that it's a 2-week series. And I welcome to the program Andrea Vogt. She's written a book that impressed us so much that we've asked her to be on our program for 2 weeks. And I have a copy of the book. It's called Common Courage, Bill Wassmuth, Human Rights and Small Town Activism. And we highly recommend this book. I would like to say to you that it's, in my view, it's just absolutely outstanding. And it deals with the life of Bill Wassmuth, who was a certainly Northwest and even nationally known human rights activist, and not only about his philosophy, but it also deals with small towns in our area and what they did to combat hate. Our guest has certainly coming to us with great credentials. She is a graduate of the University of Idaho in political science. She was a very, very outstanding journalist with the Spokesman Review for a number of years. She's a Fulbright scholar, was in Germany dealing with European family leave policy, and she also continues her work with the international travel writing with the National Geographic Travel. Andrea, it's good to have you back in town, and congratulations, a really outstanding book.
Thank you, Tony. I'm so pleased to be here.
And I'm so pleased to have 3 panel members to question our guest today and next week. First of all, Janelle Burke, an attorney in Idaho. Next to her is Mary Lou Reed, a former Idaho State Senator. And then we have Erna Reinhardt, who's Director of Public Relations at North Idaho College. And with that, we will open the questioning with Janelle Burke.
Andrea, we want to know a little bit about you so that our viewers can understand where we're coming from. Would you please tell us a little bit how you became interested in this particular subject and how you decided to write about it?
Sure. Well, I should start out by saying my family has been in Idaho for 4 generations. I was born and raised in Potlatch, Idaho, a small northern Idaho town. So I care a lot about this state, and that was sort of the root behind why I began this project. But really, the University of Idaho Press approached me after I returned from a Fulbright in Europe and asked me if I would be interested in doing some in-depth interviews with Bill Wassmuth, who had just been diagnosed with Lou Gehrig's disease. So I was really a reporter looking for a story, and it found me. I spent then the next year doing in-depth interviews with Bill Wassmuth as he was dying of Lou Gehrig's disease over a course of about 7 months.
Thank you.
Mary Lou Reed.
Well, Andrea, I have to say thank you. You have done, I think, a beautiful job of capturing the essence of Bill, of his strength and his wit. He's a very funny fellow, and his significance. And so I really, as someone who knew Bill for a long time, am appreciative of what you've done in getting this down. Would you tell us a little bit about your methodology? How did you go about the process of commuting, I believe from Moscow to Ellensburg, to interview Bill over this time, and how you did it and how he responded?
Sure. Well, I originally approached Bill about the project, and he said, no, I'm not interested. I don't want a biography written about me. I don't want it to be all about me. So I went back and I tried to come up with a different structure for the book, one that would show his personal story, but also talk in a more general way about human rights and small towns and the rural West and how we can fight hate in the future. And so the book is split into 2 parts, really: the biographical narratives about his life, and then the themed chapters about the role of community, the role of education, the role of churches and faith groups in fighting hate. Once he saw that structure, he signed on and said, okay, this is something I want to be a part of. And so I would drive from Pullman to Ellensburg. It was about a 4-hour drive through eastern Washington flatlands across the Columbia to his house, and we would sit down in his living room. He was in a wheelchair when I began, and we would sit for about 3-4 hours in the beginning and do interviews and talk all afternoon. Toward the end of the interviews, at the end of the 6 months, those lasted quite a bit shorter. His breathing capacity had gone downhill, and we were having much shorter interviews, but they were still very meaningful, and he was very forthcoming and very open, and we developed quite a friendship over those 6 months.
Quite an empathy.
Yes.
Right.
Erna Reinhardt.
Andrea, I want to welcome you back to North Idaho College. I know that I worked with you earlier when you were an education reporter at the Spokesman Review, and you did an awesome job covering NIC back then, and I want to congratulate you on your book. I have finished the book, and it's wonderful. You did an awesome job, and you were always a good writer, and you're still a good writer.
Thank you.
Tell us a little bit, let's talk a little bit about Bill's roots, Bill Wassmuth, and tell us about Green Creek, Idaho, and what's that like? I've never been there. And tell us about how Bill's, how his values were shaped by his family and his roots, where he's from.
Well, Green Creek is a tiny little town on the Camas Prairie near Grangeville up in north central Idaho. It is a very Catholic, German farmers mostly, and there was a real sense of community there. I think those values of sort of communal neighborliness and caring for one's neighbor as thy would thy own came from that early upbringing in Green Creek. He went into the monastery, the seminary, training for the priesthood at a very young age, at age 13, and then went into Mount St. Angel, which is a Benedictine monastery in Oregon. And there, again, in the monastery and the seminary training, there was a very communal sense of love thy neighbor. It was just further reinstated what he had learned in Green Creek. And I think that courses through this book about the importance of working together as a community for a greater good. And so that both the Green Creek and I think his time in the Benedictine monastery both are reflected in his later years, how much he believed in community and believed in the good that could come about when people put their heads together in a small town.
I'm very impressed with your format where you have a chapter about part of his life and then a chapter on the work and the philosophy. So it's very difficult to know how much to say, let's talk about Bill, and how much to talk about his philosophy and his ideas. But I'm going to build upon Erna's question a little bit further in the book. I knew him so well for so long, but yet there's so many things in here I did not know about, and that was your great gift to get all of that out in the story. I was so impressed when his parents took him on that long ride to leave home to start his work to become a priest. And tell us a little more about two things. One is the kind of the loneliness when he was left at first, and then from that experience, take us in a little bit to when he became a priest, and he served several different parishes in that time, and that also really helped carve out his thinking.
Well, he was very lonely when he first went into the seminary. He had never left. He led a sheltered life in Green Creek, and he wasn't sure it was for him. The first 2 years, he really struggled. He would snap pictures of how the Willamette Valley farmers in Oregon tilled their crops in circles rather than strips, and he would send it to his pop back home. You know, that's how much he missed Idaho as he was up in his seminary on the top of this hill, very isolated location. But he grew into it. He made friends with the other Idaho fellows at the seminary and soon became a leader within the men of his class, was elected class president, started to head many different groups within the seminary, so he was early on building those leadership skills.
Which continued through the rest of his life.
Yes, indeed, and I think he was probably a natural-born leader. But he went on to in Seattle, he was at St. Thomas, and when he was ordained as a priest in Green Creek, they automatically had a job waiting for him in Boise as a parish priest. He worked in Boise, also in Caldwell in the migrant worker camps, which in those days, it was the late 60s and early 70s, conditions were deplorable in those migrant worker camps outside of Twin Falls and Caldwell. He spoke a little Spanish, and so the diocese sent him to do work in the camps, and that made a very early impression on him from a human rights and a social justice perspective. But then he was also the parish priest in McCall, Idaho, and that was the best gig he'd ever had. He said he was a snowball's throw from the ski hill, and he would do mass out on the power boats out on the lake. And the only time anybody ever asked for him was, "Why aren't you coming down to have coffee in town more often?" He said once his phone went out for 4 days and no one noticed, because it was such a quiet existence as a priest in McCall, Idaho. But after McCall, then he went down to the religious education office and served in a bureaucratic position within the diocese for 10 years, commuting between Boise and Washington, D.C., and was really moving up within the ranks of the church before he later left that and went back to being a parish priest in Coeur d'Alene.
And he spent 9 years here. Usually there's a transfer after 6 years, and I remember the bishop of Idaho saying, because of this important work you're doing here, they extended it for another period of time. Janelle Burke.
I want to go back a little bit to this education. Was his work with education then something that later became very formative in his philosophy?
Well, yes, he believed firmly that diversity in education in particular was very important. And partly, I think, because he saw early on that globalization was having an impact on the rural communities in the West, that it was important because of this interconnected world we live in, that students be able to appreciate difference and tolerance, not only for just because it's right, but because for economical reasons and many others, it would be important for the future of those students to be able to appreciate many different cultures and different ways of thinking. And he pressured, I shouldn't say pressured, but he worked on that as the religious education director within the Catholic Church. He was, for a while, in charge of a committee, a nationwide committee within the American Catholic Church to write the catechism guidelines. He headed that committee. There were 12 priests from across the nation, and he wrote those catechism guidelines with social justice at its heart, and really keeping in mind tolerance and diversity within the church writings. So I think he did practice what he preached, and clear on down into trying to make change within the American Catholic institution.
Thank you.
Mary Lou Reed.
Well, he loved being a parish priest, I think. I think that was really where his heart was, and he didn't want to go up in the bureaucracy. And you tell a charming story about how he put letters into his own personnel file to make sure that he would not advance. Would you elaborate on that? Because
Well,
it was just so Bill.
Yeah, this was a funny story. You know, while he was working in Washington, D.C. for I think it was the National Association of Bishops, he was doing a lot of lobbying on behalf of the church, flying back and forth between Boise and D.C. And he had heard from some friends that his name was being bandied about for a bishop nomination from Rome. And he didn't want it. He was nervous that his political activism and his ideas might eventually come into conflict with the church if he continued to go up in the church hierarchy. And so he decided to sort of torpedo those efforts. And he would write, on the plane home to Boise, he would write these letters saying, "Dear delegate, I, Bill Wassmuth, support optional celibacy for priests and also the ordination of women as priests. Sincerely yours, Bill Wassmuth." Knowing that when those letters were received by the delegate within the church, they would go into his personnel file, and if the bishop nomination ever came forth, they would open up his file to see what he'd been up to, read the letters, and say, "Forget it." And so apparently this must have worked, because the nomination never was realized. But he, after this time in Washington, D.C., and as he said, he was getting tired of waking up in a place where the newspaper wouldn't crinkle when you opened it in the morning because of the humidity. He just said, I'm tired of working with the people who are working with the people. I want to go back and be a priest in my home state. And that's when he went back to his bishop and said, "Is there a parish position open?" And that's when he took the Coeur d'Alene job.
And his life changed. Many others from that point on in a
Yes.
very great way. Erna?
I know we want to get into the human rights realm, but I've got another question about his church experience and his spirituality experiences. But I was real touched by his experience at Seattle University. To me, that was, it must have been a very enlightening period for him. And it seemed like that was when he went a different direction with his religious philosophy, that before it was a pretty narrow focus, and that it seemed like whatever happened at Seattle University, he was really encouraged to broaden that. And it was the whole look at social justice, and I'm thinking that maybe that was the beginning of his work with human rights. But can you talk a little bit about his experience at Seattle University and how that really broadened his view?
Well, Bill Wassmuth went to Seattle University in 1970, 71, 72, to get his master's degree in religious education. And part of what was happening at Seattle University, I think, is part of the greater context about what was happening within the Catholic Church after Vatican II. And I won't go into too much detail about that history, but essentially there was a shift in the pastoral approach. And at Seattle University, they were teaching the pastoral approach that you want to try to fit your message to the people rather than having the people sort of conform to your message. That was a very different idea at the time of pastoring, religious pastoring. And he had been giving Latin Mass up until that point, and all of a sudden he had a breakthrough, and he started realizing that this was a way he could reach out and really touch his parishioners and make the scriptures more relevant to them. And he was very influenced by the Jesuit professors at Seattle University who had been in South America. Many of them knew about liberation theology and some of the social movements that were happening in South America at the time, and that was very influential on Bill Wassmuth. But mostly, I would say, the differing pastoral approach, that you try to shape your message to the people's lives rather than having them conform to the old rigid institutional way of thinking about Catholicism. That was a big change, not only in Bill Wassmuth's way of pastoring, but in the greater church as a whole, and in a lot of the religious the men of the cloth at the time. That was a major shift in Catholic social theory.
Again, I'm always struggling with where to go because there's so much to talk about, but I want to ask you a question about diversity on the next program. That's my carrot for my viewers. There's a tremendous thing you had to say about enrichment of diversity, and I'll save that till next week. But the way that you structured the book, and we've already mentioned that briefly, but would you go through the different areas that you have covered? Because those are areas that Bill Wassmuth himself saw as part of this movement of human rights, social justice, and spirituality. If you take each one of those, like one was education, one was the church, give us a kind of a overview of how he saw each of those as vital to having a society where we celebrate those differences.
Well, the themes covered in the book are the role of education, the role of community, the role of small towns, the role of religion, of faith. And he believed that all of those elements, community, religion, education, all had a very pivotal role in human rights. For example, the role of faith. He worked all his life to try to get church groups and mainstream denominations to speak out more aggressively against hate. He believed in the power of the church and the power of the small town pastor to make a difference in a community. And he was very effective in bringing together mainstream Christian denominations to speak out against hate. And the reason why he thought this was so important was because many of the hate groups are using theology as a basis for their beliefs. And so he said, we have to out-Bible them. We have to, speak out and talk about what the scriptures mean to us as mainstream denominations. And he worked on that up until his death. He was working to bring together mainstream pastors from all sorts of different denominations to speak out against hate. So that was very important to him. Also, the role of community. He believed in the innate ability of small towns to come together, sort of that pioneering spirit of the rural West, love thy neighbor, He believed that rural people in rural small towns really had what it takes to fight hate.
In a coalition form.
Yes, because also from coalition building point of view, that was important to him. You had to have a Republican and a Democrat, older people, younger people, people from different religions and races working together. That's the glue that made it stick in these task forces, was to have a broad-based coalition of people working. Education, he thought that there should be more human rights education than there currently is, and more of an emphasis on diversity and the importance of it from not only diversity education, but in what we're reading and the different kinds of things that students have access to.
So reconstruction of curricula in many cases, and when he was with the Northwest Coalition, working to bring up some of that into the schools, not only in conferences and workshops, but actually in teaching teachers how to deal with this process.
Well, and not only curricula, but teachers, for example, being aware of what is a hate crime, and how do we respond within our school if a student is attacked, or how do we address bigotry when it happens in the hallways. All of those issues about school climate, I think, not just curriculum, but also school climate and how to respond to students who are in need.
And all of these are just remarkable in your book and how you develop them, but one more in relation to that, and that is you spend a lot of time, based on his philosophy, the difference between a large urban center and a small town, and his great faith in small towns being able to do as much or even more than large cities.
Well, I think he believed, and of course we all have seen that this is true, that it's a lot easier to make change in a small town. It's like moving a sailboat as opposed to a battleship. And change can happen fast, and it can happen with not too much effort. And so that's, he really had a lot of faith in the small towns. In a big city, it's harder to get all of these diverse coalitions of people together. They don't know each other. There's more infighting. He found it much more difficult to organize in urban areas as opposed to the rural areas. And you wouldn't necessarily think that would be the case, because one might assume that it would be harder to organize for human rights in the rural areas of the Intermountain West. He found just the opposite to be true. It was harder to organize in Portland, Oregon than it was in Rawlins, Wyoming.
That's true. And during those times when he was executive director and I was serving as president, as we would have our conferences each year, if we went to a place like Seattle, we'd have 200 delegates. We went to a smaller place, Boise being smaller, we'd have 600 delegates. And so there's a lot of evidence for that. Before we go back to Janelle, we don't have a lot of time left, but I do want people to know how to get your book, and then we'll also tell them again next week. I'll ask our staff to put up on the screen two things. You have a website, and it's come up on the screen now, where they could contact you for the book, and also we have it at the North Idaho College bookstore, and that telephone number is up there. Okay. So you might repeat that for them as far as your website's concerned.
Oh, well, the website is www.thefreelancedesk.com. It's available online through my own website. There's also some more information about the book there. Also, the University of Idaho Press has it available online on their website.
Yes. And then we have it at our bookstore in Idaho College, and we saw the telephone number, plus those who visit our campus, they will be at the bookstore. It's just a remarkable book. Janelle Burke.
I would like to ask you a little bit about the size of what you call a small community. Maybe we need to define that, and also define what some of the components are in a small community.
Well, Bill and I never really did define that. I think it ranges from maybe what we might consider mid-sized, Billings, Montana, even Coeur d'Alene. I think the urban, Seattle was an urban center, Portland an urban center, but pretty much the rest of the rural West is a fairly small town. And we never did, specifically define that. What was the second part of your question?
The second part of my question was, what are the components of a small town? What are the parts of a small town? Did he see value in certain kinds of parts of the small community?
Well, I think he believed that you needed to have a very broad-based coalition represented when you had a human rights task force. You needed to have the Republican and the Democrat. It needed to be nonpartisan. You needed to have law enforcement because they decide, is this a hate crime and should it be prosecuted as such? They can help protect activists when they come under fire, as they often do. So you need to have law enforcement involvement, young people, older people, Jews, Muslims, Christians, people from different races and backgrounds. That way, the coalition really holds together because, it's so broad-based. Bill Wassmuth was really good at that kind of organizing because I think of his work as a priest. He knew how to relate to many different kinds of people. He could bring many different kinds of people together. He liked to talk about how good of friends he was with Phil Batt, the Republican governor of Idaho, and he had friends on both sides of the aisle, and that really helped make what he did a success.
Mary Lou, we have about a minute left.
Oh, well, Bill was so open for change, which I think is interesting. Growing up in such a traditional home, in a traditional society, in a traditional organization, and yet he loved change. He loved speed. He loved modernity in all its parts. And when he came to Coeur d'Alene as a parish priest, he came with an afro and a leather jacket, and he was so completely non-judgmental. And did you find any more clues than the rest of us had as how this could happen?
He was a very unconventional priest, and people loved him for that. But he was never afraid to speak his mind. He was very non-judgmental. He always had an open mind, and I think that made him very effective. He was the everyman. He was like you or me, a small town farm boy from Idaho, raised on basic values from the Bible, like the Good Samaritan or the Golden Rule. I think people could relate to that side of him, that he was so open and was non-judgmental. That made him an incredibly effective agent for change.
On that note, we bring the program to conclusion today, and I want to again really push this book and emphasize Andrea Vogt's book on common courage, Bill Wassmuth, human rights, and small town activism. I have a copy here. And again, we want to thank the University of Idaho Press for making this possible with the author, Andrea Vogt. The good news is that she will be back with us again next week at the same time, and we will do part 2 of this program and get into some more depth about human rights and what he thought about it and spirituality and how social justice works. I hope you'll be with us at that time when we continue this very important interview. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running in-house college production on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station. Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced at North Idaho College on the shores of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guest.
I welcome you back. From last week, we were interviewing a wonderful author by the name of Andrea Vogt and her book called Common Courage, Bill Wassmuth, Human Rights and Small Town Activism. Again, I would like to show a copy of the book and highly recommend it for your reading. And certainly it's available through North Idaho College at our bookstore and also our author's website and the University of Idaho Press, and we'll put those up later in the program. But our guest is a graduate of the University of Idaho with a baccalaureate in political science. She was a Fulbright scholar in Germany, dealing with the topic of European family leave policy, and she also writes for the National Geographic Travel. She was a very, very outstanding journalist with the Spokesman Review. And Andrea, welcome back. We just got started really last week, and we're just so thrilled with this very important work. We think it'll be very, very not only powerful to tell the history of Bill and the whole human rights movement in the region, but give people in the future courage to also speak out. Thank you so much for being here again.
Thank you, Tony. It's my pleasure.
And I'm very pleased to welcome our panel. First of all, Janelle Burke, who's an attorney in the state of Idaho, and Mary Lou Reed, a former state senator in our state, and also Erna Reinhardt, who's Director of Public Relations at North Idaho College. And Janelle will start today's questioning.
It was a pleasure to have you here last week, and we had a wonderful conversation about a favorite person that I believe all of us were acquainted with. And you talked about his beginnings. He was born in a very small town in Idaho, and he eventually went away to seminary at a relatively early age, became involved with the church and worked in the church, became a parish priest. You talked a little bit about his philosophy with regard to community, church, and also education. But there came a time in Bill's life when he was a parish priest, but he decided that he could no longer be a parish priest. Can you talk a little bit about that and what a difficult decision that was for him?
Well, it was one of the most difficult things he ever did, and the discussion he had with his bishop when he told him he wanted to leave the priesthood was the most difficult conversation he ever had. He said, when Bill went into the priesthood, it was a time within the Catholic Church when optional celibacy for priests, the right for priests to marry, was being discussed very seriously as a possible change within the Catholic Church. He thought that would happen. He really thought that someday he would be able to be a priest and marry. I think midway through his life, and when he was a parish priest at Coeur d'Alene, he realized that was not going to happen. And he did not want to grow old alone. He wanted a companion. He did not want to die alone. His father died during those years, and his mother had been at his father's side. And I remember him telling me, I realized at that moment, I don't want to be alone. And so he chose to leave the priesthood so that he could marry a wonderful woman who stayed with him until his last days, Mary Frances, very loving wife. And it was a difficult time, a very difficult transition. It took about 2 years, and he met with spiritual advisors, met with his closest friends and parish counselors before coming out publicly and announcing his intentions.
Mary Lou Reed.
Well, Bill didn't want this book to be just about him, and you have done a very thorough job of making sure that didn't happen by doing a lot of research. I think it will be valuable not only for those of us who cared about Bill, but really you have chronicled the history and the events dealing with the white supremacists, with the Aryan nations, etc. Would you like to talk a little bit about your own work and how you went about it and where you found all these facts, because you've got it all together?
Well, thank you. I relied on my reporting skills for that part of the book. Really went in, studied the microfiche, read all of the daily newspapers from about 1975 until about I guess it would have been 89. So during that whole process, reread. Of course, I was just starting high school the year that Bill Wassmuth's house was bombed, so I really needed to do my legwork. And I went back through the microfiche, read all of the press accounts, read just about every book. I think every book I could get my hands on that had been written about it. Then I also delved into the Catholic history, read and boned up on what was happening in the Catholic Church in the context of the time, and really tried to clarify and put into context Bill's life and the struggle for human rights in Idaho, into the greater context of what was happening in the Northwest at the time, what was happening in the Catholic Church at the time, so that it wasn't just Bill's story in isolation, but a bigger story, the story of how Idahoans fought back against hate. I think that's a story that hasn't really been told. So often Idahoans are cast as just racist and ignorant and apathetic, when in truth there are many, many citizens of the state who worked very hard on behalf of human rights and who made a difference. And I think that this book really allows those Idahoans' views to come forth.
I appreciate that. I also appreciate the fact that even those of us who've been here and involved may not have all of the significance of it until we see the connections with the Aryan nations, with the order, with the other individuals across the country, that it wasn't just a tired old man out there at Hayden Lake. It really was a dangerous movement.
Yes, and in fact, the Aryan Nations followers who bombed Bill Wassmuth's house, and he narrowly escaped injury during that 1986 bombing, but they did have connections to the order and to various different sundry groups, and that didn't become clear until much later on, once the trials had happened, once they'd been sentenced. And so what I tried to do was go back and then draw that history out and put it in perspective, because at the time that it happened in 1986, it wasn't clear who all they were connected to. And it took 5 years for all of the trials to happen and the sentencing. So to go back and put the perspective on that, it really did sort of shed some new light on how all of these groups were connected.
And makes it much more serious. Yeah.
Yes, it was very serious.
Erna Reinhardt.
Bill Wassmuth had a very strong philosophy about how human rights and the whole battle in North Idaho should be handled. And I know I took notes this morning, and what you called it this morning was his nonviolent, proactive philosophy. And in Coeur d'Alene, in North Idaho, there was a real divide over how the business community felt that should be handled and how the human rights people thought that should be handled, the whole Aryan Nations presence. Can you tell us a little bit about Bill's philosophy and the meaning behind that?
Well, you're right, there was a divide. And in the beginning, there was the camp that said, they ignore it and it'll go away camp. So, just leave them be. Let's not stir this up. We're just giving them more attention. Bill never subscribed to that. He always believed you really had to speak out aggressively, but in a nonviolent way. He and the task force members coined a phrase, saying yes to human rights is the best way to say no to racism. And I think that sort of sums up their idea. It was to have a positive outpouring of support on behalf of human rights, rather than to show up at the parade saying no to Richard Butler. And unfortunately, the media was always at the parade. And so oftentimes there would be 1,000, 2,000 people in the adjacent park, with banners saying, "We support human rights." And of course, CNN's cameras are trained on the 15 neo-Nazis marching down Main Street. Exactly. However, this tells the story of those thousands of people in the park. And I think it was in a very effective stance. It would have been much more divisive and much less productive to focus on the negative, to focus on Richard Butler, than to focus on community unity.
And Bill was such a leader in that. I mean, it was really him and the Kootenai County Task Force. But Bill really led the community in that philosophy.
And I think his spiritual beliefs were part of that. And I think he, like Gandhi or Martin Luther King, he believed that that kind of proactive, nonviolent way of protesting was the right way. And I think that had some religious grounding.
I was so impressed with the foreword in your book, and that says a lot for your great quality in this book. I have often said that the Southern Poverty Law Center in Montgomery, Alabama, has been the most effective organization in America using the courts to combat hate, and they certainly were involved in the defeat of the Aryan Nations here in the Sewell case, majorly involved in bankrupting that group. And Morris Dees is the head of that legal team, and remarkable and successful, and has never lost a civil suit dealing with hate crimes. I would like for you to share with our audience a little bit about what Morris Dees said in your introduction.
Well, he was very, very kind. He was a good friend of Bill Wassmuth, and he wrote a very personal foreword in this book. And there's a funny place where he said they were meeting at Bill's house to talk about the bombing and decide what they were going to do, were they going to sue, how they were going to respond to this. And after they finished talking, Wassmuth turned to Morris Dees and said, "Hey, would you like a beer?" And Morris Dees was shocked, and he said, "Man, you're a Catholic priest, aren't you?" He said, "Well, I'm going to convert from Baptist to Catholic because you guys have beer-drinking priests." But that was an example of how Bill Wassmuth could put people at ease, and he just was the everyman. But that's an example of one of the anecdotes that Morris Dees tells in this foreword. It's really a very nice contribution on his part.
I can't resist knowing Morris Dees real well, and he was raised a Southern Baptist, and Southern Baptists don't believe in drinking alcohol. Doesn't mean all of them have practiced that, but of course the Catholics are more generous in that area, and so that's why I'm sure as a Southern Baptist he was surprised. Janelle Burke.
Bill Wassmuth moved into the civil rights movement, not just in North Idaho, but throughout the whole Northwest. Can you talk a little bit about what happened in those years in the Northwest Coalition?
Well, when he left the parish priest position in Coeur d'Alene, he went to Seattle, and very soon after he had moved to Seattle, he became the executive director of the Northwest Coalition Against Malicious Harassment. And under his leadership, it really thrived. He had the support of 6 different governors of 6 different states. So all the way from the governor's office down to the small, tiny little task force in a tiny little town. It was a very effective organization in those days. I might note, though, that he said he didn't believe that would be his biggest legacy. He believed that the small town task forces he helped found, he drove this red Subaru, he must have put 300,000 miles on it, to Montana and Wyoming and Colorado. He thought that those would outlast the Northwest Coalition, and indeed I think he prophesied that accurately in the book, unfortunately.
Well, I don't know when to ask this because I don't know how many minutes we have, but I want to make sure that we plumb your response to the fact you're dealing with someone with ALS, and your understanding of the disease, I'm sure, was incredibly enhanced by your the progress that Bill made into, well, actually it wasn't progress, as the disease progressed. Would you talk, why you chose to do the epilogue?
Yeah, well, for the viewers, the epilogue of this book is very different from the rest of the book. It is just a transcript, a raw transcript of my questions and his answers. And so you really get the feeling that you're in that living room when I'm doing the interviews. The reason why I did that was because that particular interview, it was January, it was right after Christmas, it was foggy. Maybe that's why we ended up talking about the elephant in the room, which was his impending death from Lou Gehrig's disease. It was so poignant as he said it, I thought to myself, I can't write this any better. I'm going to leave it. And so it's just my question and his answer. And he talks about Lou Gehrig's disease, how he was dealing with it, how he was planning to die well. And that's a part of this book. It doesn't really deal with human rights, but there are some very important lessons on how to die well. Bill Wassmuth did, and he talks about that in this book. You know, he held on to his sense of humor and his wit and his intellectual curiosity, even to the frustrating end. ALS, 5,000 people diagnosed each year. Half of them die within 3 years. It's a very rapid deterioration. And what essentially happens is the motor neurons that connect the brain to the muscles atrophy, and that garbles the healthy signals that once flowed between them. So really, your brain and alertness stays very clear while the muscles in the body atrophy. So it was very difficult. He would stop doing things about a week or 2 before he couldn't do them to avoid becoming frustrated. So he knew if next week he wasn't going to be able to push 911 on the telephone, he stopped using the telephone. And so to avoid becoming frustrated by his disease, he never let it catch him. You know, he was always stopping doing things before he couldn't do them. And that was something that I think showed a lot of vision. There are many examples like that in the book of how he gracefully and in a dignified way dealt with a very difficult and frustrating disease.
And always with humor.
Always with humor.
Erna Reinhardt.
What a segue, but I'm going to go a different direction. Bill Wassmuth had so many wonderful characteristics and traits, and he left so many wonderful things for us. I wanted you to take a few moments to tell us, what is the one overarching lesson that you learned from Bill Wassmuth, and what do you think it is that Bill Wassmuth would have wanted us to take away from his life?
He would have wanted us to roll up our sleeves and continue to work on behalf of human rights in our local communities, because apathy is too often interpreted as acceptance, not only by those who hate, but by the greater public and by those who've been the targets of hate. He would have wanted us to just speak out in our everyday lives, and that's sort of what the book's title is about, Common Courage. It doesn't take any mammoth effort. It takes just everyday kind of courage that we all have, and that he had, and he showed us, I think, well, how to use it.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to pass on this round because I'm going to have the last question, so I'll go, and I know that they want to deal with some other things like his humor and all, but I'll go back to Janelle.
Well, I am going to get to that humor,
Okay.
because I know you say that he had a wonderful sense of humor. Can you share with us some of the examples?
Yeah, and they are throughout the book, really. But you know, I was just talking to a woman who knew him, who had visited him in Boise when he was working for the diocese. She had seen his bishop in the hallway earlier that day. When she went to Bill, she said, "Oh, I saw your boss today," and he looked at her. He said, "You talk to God?" But you know, this was the kind of thing. He was always joking with people, but even to the end, when you would think it would be so difficult for someone to joke at the stage of a disease that is fatal. I remember one lunch, we sat down, took a break from our interviewing, sat down. I was having a piece of chocolate cake. He decided he wanted to have a huge, greasy hamburger. He looked over at me and he said, "What's it going to do, kill me?" That was the same week he stopped wearing sunscreen. And he was preparing to have his feeding tubes installed. And I remember he said to me, "Oh yeah, once the general populace gets a wind of these feeding tubes, they're really going to catch on." He said, and before you know it, instead of saying, "Pour me a drink," you'll be saying, "Pour a drink in me." It's a dark kind of humor, but yet he made people laugh. Not only himself, but he made others laugh clear up until the end. And I think that he had a wonderful sense of humor, and it comes out in the book, but it stuck with him till the very end.
Well, that just reminds me that visiting Bill towards the end of his life, you go apprehensively in to see him because you just felt so bad that this was happening, and go away feeling really inspired and happy, because he always twinkled. His eyes twinkled to the very end.
One of his favorite tricks was people would come in and they'd say, "Bill, how are you?" And he'd say, "I'm dying, thanks, how are you?" and he'd break the ice.
But it didn't seem like dark humor.
No.
It really was ice-breaking. Kind of.
Yeah, it was.
There was one point that I just wanted to get across that I thought, in your tapes, you caught things that the rest of us had never heard. And he had so much about education. And one thing stuck with me, that the wisdom of parents needing to teach tolerance when children are very young. Because what they give them then follows their views on other people, biases, etc., throughout life. Are there any other points on education that just you think you'll use in raising your young son?
Well, I think you touch on a really important one. He was talking about tolerance in education before the public school started. He was talking about parents raising better children. And he was even talking about in the hospitals. So a child is born, and the parents, as part of their preparation, learn a little bit about living, what it's going to mean for this child to live in a diverse world. So he was really thinking about education, tolerance in education from a very early stage. And I think that is very important, and I intend to use his example, follow his example in raising my own children, that's for sure.
That's wonderful. And of course, then he said, and even though I have no children of my own, but more children call me father than anybody else.
That's right. He liked to say that.
Erna Reinhardt.
I don't have a question, and I know you guys were very, very close to Bill, so do you guys have another thing you want to ask?
Oh, yes, I have
Okay.
lots of questions.
Perfect.
I didn't want to ignore you, Erna.
It's funny, as a reporter, I'm used to asking the questions, not answering them. So
Now, let me assure you, you're as equally effective
Good.
answering as you are asking questions.
I don't know.
Bill was a very complex person, and people of his ability are. And we're going to close the program in a few minutes with a incredibly, I think, powerful quote. But before we do that, as you got to know him so well, and I think that he opened up to you in a way, and there was a part of Bill that was very private. Mm-hmm. He was, in some ways, although he was so extroverted, there was also a shyness in Bill, and part was his upbringing, and it's part of the, I think, the German influence of being somewhat reserved. Did you see that in some of, even though it was so important to him to get this message across, this was live after him, but did you notice that in him also?
Oh yes, he would blush. I was very forward with my questioning, and I pushed him until he no longer wanted to be forthcoming, and that was often an awkward moment. When we were talking about celibacy in the priesthood, when we were talking about his reasons for leaving the priesthood, what it's like to be a celibate priest, when we were talking about personal issues like that, he would often blush and get embarrassed, and I would gently probe him to continue. And then when he no longer wanted to talk about it, he stopped. So someone asked me once, well, is there anything he asked to have taken out of the book? And I say, no, absolutely not. But there were moments in our interviews where he just didn't want to go any farther, as I think anyone probably would who appreciates their privacy.
And when that happened, that was it.
That was it. You know, I tried. I pushed pretty hard, but you know, he was pretty stubborn at that point.
One of the most powerful things he ever said, I think, you put in the book, and has to do with the difference between believing in and living diversity and isolating yourself. And I would appreciate if you would read from that.
Oh yes, that really was a thought that has stuck with me, and I'd be happy to read this quote. You know, he really believed that those who appreciated rather than resented diversity would live a richer and fuller life because they did not limit themselves to a narrow field of experiences. And so what he said was, if I choose only to deal with men, he said, I am missing the female perspective of what life is all about. If I deal only with Christians, I'm missing what Jews, Hindus, Muslims, or Native American cultures contribute. And if I choose only to be with whites, I'm missing other unique perspectives. Prejudice is suffocating. It denies one the fullness of life experience. And Wassmuth urged everyone he spoke to, his friends, his family, congregations, public audiences, students, to embrace such a full life by embarking on this journey toward becoming a society accepting of diversity, a society that views diversity as a crucial source of enrichment rather than as a threat. And even in the twilight of his life, you know, he used his last reserves of strength to give the interviews that form the core of this book, and he extended an invitation in this book to others in hopes that they might follow the path that he led to common ground.
Some of us here particularly knowing him so well, and you certainly got to know him well, and that very intense interview schedule that very last year of his life. But I want us to also thank some people who made this possible. It certainly takes some finances to do so, and would you take this time now to, and we're going to ask some people on the screen also where they can get this book on your website, and also they can get it at North Idaho College. The telephone number will go up at our bookstore at North Idaho College, but that you did have some support, and I know all of those organizations are delighted that that they did try to be in a small way a part of something that was so important.
Well, I did independently finance the book, but there was some help from the Idaho Humanities Council. I had a grant from Idaho Humanities Council. Also, the Schreck Family Foundation was very, very helpful in financing the project, as well as there was small donations from the Latah County Human Rights Task Force and the Kootenai County Human Rights Task Force. But primarily, I would say the Idaho Humanities Council and the Schreck Family Foundation really gave the project a boost. And the University of Idaho Press, of course, had the vision to start this process, this project. And so they deserve the credit for getting this off the ground.
And Ivar Nelson's the head of the
Yes.
press there. But you know, there's some magic sometimes that develops. The University of Idaho Press, I understand, was the one that decided that this needed to be done. And they contacted you. We said a little about that in the first show, but my point that I want to make is that Bill Wassmuth had an extraordinary talent in communications. He could take a very complex issue and condense it down into a few very powerful words that everyone in society could understand. I think you have the same great ability to take what he did and with your powerful use of the language to connect it together. And I would suggest without the University of Idaho Press finding someone who had that ability to put these two together, it could not be the success it was.
Well, I think we were a good match for each other. We became very close friends. I didn't intend for that to happen. This project started out, we were reporter and source, but it was natural. We became friends, and it was good for the book. He opened up to me, and I was able to write from the heart, and I think the book is stronger for it. We came to each other at the right time. I think he was happy to be giving back to community one more time. He was going to get one last word in, and I was there at the right time, and I learned from him. He's one of my heroes, Tony, and I think it's been a wonderful 2 years, and I would do it again if I had to.
And if he was here, he would say his favorite statement about this is, "We're on a roll." That's what he loved to say. When things were going well, he would say to us, "We're on a roll." With that, we bring our permanent conclusion. Ladies and gentlemen, please be with us again next week when we deal with another issue. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running in-house college production on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.